So we'll be continuing with the series that Bill has been doing on the red letters, the teachings of Jesus. We're continuing in Luke, and I want to read a parable from Luke chapter 12. I'm going to be reading from today's English version. If you want to follow along, it's Luke 12, starting verse 16. And then Jesus told them this parable. A rich man had land which bore good crops. He began to think to himself, I don't have a place to keep all my crops. What can I do? This is what I will do, he told himself. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, where I can store the grain and all my other goods. And then I'll say to myself, lucky man, you have all the good things you need for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, enjoy yourself. But God said to him, you fool, this very night you will have to give up your life. And then you will get and then who will get all these things you have kept for yourself? Jesus concluded, this is how it is with those who pile up riches for themselves, but are not rich from God's point of view. So it's a parable, a teaching story. And whenever we see a parable, usually parables are told by Jesus when there's a question or a situation of an event. And so it's always good to look at the context and say, what's happened here? What is the thing that Jesus is responding to? So if we just hop back just a couple of verses, we can see. Read with me in verse 13. Someone in the crowd said to Jesus, Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. And Jesus said to him, Man, who made me a judge or arbitrary over you? And he said to them, Take care, be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. So what seems to be going on is this family squabble. And actually, Jesus is just teaching about some other things here. And this guy interrupts him and says, Hey, tell my brother to give me my inheritance. And basically Jesus says, well, you know what? That's not what I'm here for. That's not what I'm here for. He says, but he says, he gives them two sort of teachings and he's setting up this parable. He says, first of all, you need to be on guard against greed and covetousness. Maybe he could see into this man's heart. I don't know. And then he goes on to say, well, that's because your life doesn't consist in the abundance of your possessions. Your life is not about how much stuff you have. Now, this is a tricky thing for us in our culture today, because we get messages from all over that say, you are what you have, and please get more. Buy lots of stuff. The car you have tells us a lot about you, and the clothes you drive, and I mean, clothes you wear in the car you drive. Yeah. Whatever. So to look at sort of a biblical context of this whole topic, I want to look a little bit about treasure and what Jesus has to say about treasure and his concept of treasure, sort of to lay a background for this. So treasure, when Jesus talks about it, is really, it's kind of like, what is it that consumes your attention? What's your preoccupation? It's what you live for. It's what you work for. It's what you think about. It's what you buy. It's how you spend your time. Maybe the podcast you subscribe to, or the streams you follow on Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest, TikTok, whatever. It's what is important to you above all else. And, interesting, if you've never read it, C.S. Lewis has a great little book. It's called The Great Divorce. And it's a sort of a fantasy, an allegory almost, where he tells a story of the plane between heaven and hell, where people essentially get one last chance to choose God, and people that they know come down from the hills and try to talk them into coming back with them to heaven. And it's basically a series of pictures of people and what their treasure is. With one person, it's intellectual pursuit. He doesn't want to find the answers. He just wants to play with the ideas. Another, it's family. Another, it's goods. And you just go through this whole series of people and what their treasures are and how clinging to them is keeping them away from God, really. I want to read to you a little bit out of Matthew, where Jesus talks about treasure. Matthew chapter 6 and verse 19. He says this: "Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart is also." Where your treasure is, there your heart is. Your heart, sort of the origin of emotion, of motivation, of desire. It's out of your heart that your actions come forth. And we still kind of think about that. If you're not motivated to do something, what do you say? You say, well, my heart's just not in it. We still think of the heart as sort of the source of those desires and motivations. And Jesus is saying here, fix your attention on the right things. Your treasure whatever you treasure will steer your motivation, will steer your desires, and will steer your actions. And in verse 24, he goes on to say, "No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money." Those are two treasures, God and money. And he says there's really only room in your heart for one treasure, and there's you can sort of pretend you can have it both ways, but sooner or later, there's going to be something that comes along that pits one against the other. Maybe you're being asked to compromise what you believe to be right or wrong in a business dealing or decision, or how you spend your money. Sooner or later, one of them will take over. It will show itself to be what it really is: your treasure, your master, your guiding principle, your motivation. So against this backdrop, this idea of treasure, I'd like to look at Jesus's teaching here back in Luke. And he's warning against money and possessions. He's interrupted about a money question, and so he gives this little teaching, and he says, "Watch out! Don't let the stuff win." It often comes down to God or stuff. Don't be preoccupied with stuff. So as we look at this little parable, this teaching, I think this answers three questions, and so let's look at this and see what the three questions are and what the answers are. We're back in Luke chapter 12. "The land of a rich man produced plentifully." I just want to pause right there, because this is the first question. The first question this answers is, whose stuff is it? When we think about our stuff, whose is it? You notice this is carefully worded. It says the land produced it. The guy didn't produce it. Any farmer knows you plant your seed and then you wait, and nature has to do something. There's a certain amount of this that really isn't under our control, and we can have the illusion that we're in control, even though we're not farmers. But really, what we have comes from God. Health comes from God. I mean, do I need to say, in the midst of a pandemic, when something can sort of knock us down quickly, health is a gift from God. The ability to be healthy enough to work, to have the skills and abilities to work, have the opportunities to work, and then prosperity, the good results. These are all gifts from God, and I think we sometimes forget that. In First Chronicles, David is sort of pronouncing a blessing. If you remember, David collected money to build a temple, but because of the things he'd done, God did not allow him to build it. His son Solomon built it. But here's sort of him blessing this collection of stuff. I mean, 1 Chronicles 29, starting in verse 10. So David blessed the Lord in the presence of the assembly, and he said, "Blessed are you, O Lord, the God of Israel, our Father, forever and ever. Yours, O Lord, is the greatness and the power and the glory and the victory and the majesty, and all that is in the heavens and in the earth is yours. Yours is the kingdom, O Lord, and you are exalted as head above all. Both riches and honor come from you, and you rule over all. In your hand are power and might, and in your hand it is to make great and give strength to all. And now we thank you, our God, and praise your glorious name. But who am I, and what is my people, that we should be able thus to offer willingly? For all things come from you, and of your own have we given you. For we are strangers before you and sojourners, as all our fathers were. Our days on the earth are like a shadow, and there's no abiding. O Lord our God, all this abundance that we have provided for building you a house for your holy name comes from your hand and is all your own." So he acknowledged that before God, that everything that they collected, everything they had, everything they were building the temple, people brought forth, ultimately it all came from God. It comes from God, and it's good to remember that. So that's the first question that is answered in this parable, is whose stuff is it? Where did it come from? It came from God. So let's read on. Back in Luke chapter 12, verse 16. The land of a rich man produced plentiful, and he thought to himself, "What shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops." And he said, "I'll do this. I will tear down my barns, and I'll build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry." So the second question that Jesus addresses here is, what do we do with all our stuff? What do we do with all our stuff? So if it's not our stuff, what do we do with it? And I think it's important to remember, to sort of think about this, that it isn't our stuff, it's God's stuff. And he has given it to us as stewards. Now, steward is not a word we use a whole lot anymore, but a steward is someone who takes care of other people's stuff. They manage other people's households, they manage other people's affairs, and we are stewards of what God has given us. So this is kind of a story here of what not to do with your stuff. What did the man in the parable do? He found he had a surplus, so he built bigger barns. And that's not in itself wrong. It's not wrong to store up for yourself. It's not wrong to save for a rainy day, to save for your retirement. But we look further on, and it says he built bigger barns so that he could just take it easy, relax, eat, drink, be merry. It was all about him and his comfort. I have got plenty. I want to make sure I have plenty so I can just take it easy. And this is something I've thought about, and I still kind of think about and wrestle with is as a retired guy, and some of you are retired, many of you are. As a retired guy, I think about, well, so I've stored up for all my life, I've stored up retirement funds and savings, and now I'm living off of that. And what do I do? Do I eat, drink, and be merry? I know guys who retired, and I know a couple guys I used to work with, and they go play golf every day. They play golf in the morning and have lunch at the club and sit around talking with people and go home, go to sleep, get up the next day and do it again every day. I personally, I don't play golf, and I find that boring, but for some people, this is their life. And I think it's good to think about, how do we spend our life? And even when we save up, and God has granted us the ability to save up, what do we do with it? Do we do it for our own purposes, or do we do it for those around us? If we look at Acts, and this is not to be used as an example, as a new rule, as it were, but this is the reaction of the early church when the Holy Spirit came on them and they embraced Jesus' teaching. Acts, it's a description of the early church. Acts chapter 2, reading 40, starting verse 42. And it says, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship and breaking of bread and prayers. And awe came upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were being done through the apostles. And all who believed were together and had all things in common. And they were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all as any had need. This was their response to God and his grace. Now, does this mean that God doesn't want us to have private property? That sort of a form of Christian communism? I don't believe it does. There are those who would say, yeah, but I don't believe it does. And let's just jump ahead to chapter 4, and we can see kind of what was going on a little further. 4, starting in verse 34. It says, there wasn't a needy person among them. For as many as were owners of land or houses, they sold them and brought the proceeds that were sold and laid it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to each as they had need. And thus Joseph, who was called by the apostles Barnabas, which means son of encouragement, sold a field that belonged to him and brought the money and laid it at the apostles' feet. And then we have the whole story of Ananias and Sapphira, who did something similar, except they only brought some of what they got and said it was all of it. And Peter's reaction to him, I mean, they were dealt with very sternly, but Peter's reaction is, he says, Ananias, why has Satan filled your heart to lie to the Holy Spirit and keep back part of the proceeds for the land for yourself? While it remained unsold, did it not remain your own? And after it was sold, was it not at your disposal? So even then, even though the reaction was people were giving all this money to the church and to help one another out, they still had the right to have their own stuff. And when they decided to make a gift to help others out, they could decide to give as much or as little as they wanted. It was still their stuff to watch over. And even if you look at the 8th commandment, do not steal, I mean, that kind of implies ownership. There were poor people who followed Jesus. There were middle-class people. There were rich people who followed him. Business owners, servants, landowners, soldiers, government officials, religious officials, sinners, not that we're all sinners, but people who are living a sinful lifestyle. I mean, there's no requirements, and there was no requirement that you give up everything you have to follow Jesus. You don't have to give everything away. I think we run into trouble when we try to make what God is telling us to do a universal rule and say, well, everybody's supposed to do this now. Jesus was not. I don't believe Jesus was giving us a new set of laws to follow. He was teaching here about what our priorities ought to be and how this should affect our actions. What is our treasure? What is our treasure? And it's up to each one of us to wrestle with God and talk to him and listen to him and see, how does he want us to use the stuff that he has entrusted to us for a time? So first question he answers is where did it come from? It came from God. What do we do with it? Well, we use it for God's purposes. There's a third question here that he answers, and let me just finish reading. We're starting at verse 19, starting at verse 20. But God said to him, "Fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be? So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God." So the question here is, what is real? What is real? We can kind of go through life and with sort of an illusion of the way we think it is. And there's a lot of messages the world gives us to sort of help build that illusion. But ultimately, Jesus is saying, what's really real here? Well, the first thing is real is you don't know the hour or the day of your passing from this life into the next one. You really don't. And I think certainly for me, the fact that we're in the middle of a pandemic and that we're seeing people die, and we've all been touched by it now. We know somebody. It makes you realize that we can't guarantee we're going to be alive a week from now. The reality, I think since the middle of the 20th century, when antibiotics really came into common use, there's been kind of an attitude that certain set of diseases, at least, we can just cure, give you antibiotics, give you pills, and we get better. And this idea that we could just be bopping along and suddenly something comes and we're dead, it's shocking, but it is the reality. And so I think it makes sense to plan to live a long life, plan for the future, but in some ways act as if this might be our last day. You don't know. You really don't know. And that's what he's telling the guy here in this parable. You don't know. You made all these plans to store it up, and guess what? You're not going to live to see it. The other thing that's real, though, he says in the last verse is that when it comes down to it, and it comes down to the question of God versus stuff, God versus mammon, as the old word is, or God versus money, God is more real than the stuff. It's what endures. It's what will end up being there. All the rest goes away. And again, interesting phraseology. He doesn't say don't have treasures. He says, but this is what happens to somebody who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. So what does it mean to be rich toward God? I mean, if you're rich in a material sense, you have a lot of stuff, right? And so if you're rich toward God, what does that mean? I think it means that you have God. And what does that mean? Well, you have the life that God has given us through grace, the new life. We have the privilege of knowing him experientially. We can talk with him. We can hear from him. It means you have his desires now to follow him and to see others through his eyes. And it means that we make those God's priorities our priorities. So we look to use our stuff in ways that benefit other people. That we're not focused on the stuff we have, but we're focused on God and how can we use what we have to further his purposes, to love others. I think that's what it means to be rich toward God, is to sort of seek and become more like him because of the new life in us. So the three questions: whose stuff is it? Well, it's God's stuff. What do we do with our stuff? I believe he wants us to use it in service to God and others. And what is real? Well, God is real and not the stuff. I just want to close by reading you a little piece out of a book, Freedom of Simplicity by Richard Foster. He says this. He says, Jesus Christ and all the writers of the New Testament call us to break free of mammon lust and live in joyous trust. Their radical criticism of wealth is combined with a spirit of unconditional generosity. They point to us a way of living in which everything we have, we receive as a gift, and everything we have is cared for by God, and everything we have is available to others when it is right and good. This reality frames the heart of Christian simplicity. It is the means of liberation and power to do what is right and to overcome the forces of fear and avarice. It's a way to follow him and to live in his joy. For Jesus said, your life does not consist in the abundance of your possessions.